Welcome back to US Watch Truth. Tonight at 2:34 in the morning, the most consequential single military strike in the history of modern air power occurred not in the skies above a battlefield, but on the ground beneath layers of reinforced concrete and hardened steel in the underground command complex that has directed every Israeli Air Force operation for the past 4 decades. The Israeli Air Force headquarters, located at the Kiryat Defense Compound in the heart of Tel Aviv, home to the command infrastructure that connects every Israeli combat aircraft, every air defense battery, every electronic warfare platform, and every strategic strike asset to the National Command Authority was struck at 2:34 this morning by the opening salvo of what would become a 2,100 missile Khorramshahr-4 attack, executed with a precision, a scale, and a structural logic that has left every Western air power analyst I have spoken with in the hours since completely without adequate language for what they witnessed. I need you to understand what the Israeli Air Force headquarters represented before I walk you through what happened to it tonight. This was not simply a military building. This was not simply a command center in the conventional sense of that term. This was the central nervous system of Israeli air power, the hardened operational brain through which Israel's entire air warfare capability, the F-35 Iadir squadrons, the 15 IRAM strike packages, the Arrow and David Sling air defense networks, the Iron Dome batteries protecting Israeli population centers, and the strategic intelligence and electronic warfare architecture that gave Israeli air operations their decisive, qualitative edge was commanded, coordinated, and sustained. Remove the Israeli Air Force headquarters from the operational picture, and you do not merely degrade Israeli air power. You sever the command connections that make Israeli air power coherent. You turn the most capable regional air force in the Middle East into a collection of individual platforms without the centralized direction that transforms individual capability into coordinated military power. Every Western assessment of Iranian strike capability had concluded that the Israeli Air Force headquarters, protected by its location within the Kiryat compound, its deep underground command facilities, its hardened communications architecture, and the layered air defense systems surrounding it was beyond the reach of any conventional Iranian strike package. The depth of its underground facilities, the density of its protective construction, and the sophistication of its defensive coverage were all assessed as providing protection against any missile attack Iran could plausibly generate against a target in the heart of Tel Aviv. Every one of those assessments was catastrophically wrong. 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 ballistic missiles arriving in precisely sequenced waves over 28 minutes did not merely damage the Israeli Air Force headquarters, they erased it. And in Washington, within hours of the last missile impacting the President of the United States, convened an emergency session of the National Security Council that, by every account reaching me tonight, reflected not the calm deliberation of a superpower managing a regional crisis, but the acute institutional panic of an establishment confronting a strategic reality it had told itself could not exist. This is U.S. Watch Truth. What I am about to walk you through tonight is the most significant analysis of air power strategic targeting and American strategic credibility that I have ever produced on this channel. I need you with me for every word of it. 4 questions are going to structure everything I cover tonight, and I want to lay them out for you now because each one connects to the others in ways that only become fully visible when you hold all 4 simultaneously. First, how did 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 missiles penetrate and destroy an underground command complex in the heart of Tel Aviv that Western assessments had judged invulnerable to conventional Iranian attack? And what does the operational architecture of the Israeli Air Force HQ strike reveal about the true depth of Iranian strategic targeting, intelligence, and operational planning capability that I believe the Western analytical community has been refusing to honestly assess for years? Second, What is the Khorramshahr-4 and why does its specific technical configuration, its range, its guidance, precision, its warhead specialization, and its production scale make it uniquely capable of executing the kind of deep urban strike against hardened command infrastructure that tonight's events demonstrated? Third, what drove the convening of a U.S. Emergency National Security Council session within hours of the strike? What decisions are being made in that room right now? And what does the fact that Washington's first response was an emergency meeting rather than a military action tell us about the true state of American strategic confidence? And fourth, what does the erasure of Israeli air power command and Washington's emergency session mean for the global order, the future of American extended deterrence, and the multipolar world that Iran, Russia, and China have been systematically constructing while the American establishment was assuring itself that its dominance was permanent? Every answer is coming in full depth. Stay with me. Before I go any further, I want to take a moment to speak directly to everyone watching US Watch Truth tonight for the first time, because I know that events of this magnitude bring new audiences to channels like this one. This channel exists to deliver the kind of strategic depth that the mainstream coverage of events, like tonight's, simply does not provide. The operational detail, the weapons analysis, the geopolitical context, and above all, the honest assessment of what American power can and cannot do in the world as it actually exists, not as official narratives describe it. If that is the analysis you came here for tonight, show it right now. Hit like on this video, subscribe to US Watch Truth immediately, share this across every platform and every network you have access to, and bring your own strategic assessment into the comments section below. I read everything my community produces, and I engage with the analysis you bring to the conversation. The discussion generated by this content is as important to me as the content itself. Now, let me get into the full picture of what happened at the Israeli Air Force headquarters at 2:34 this morning. The destruction of the Israeli Air Force headquarters was not the product of numerical scale alone, though I want to establish immediately that 2,100 missiles represents a strike package of a magnitude that has no precedent in the history of conventional ballistic missile warfare. No single military installation has ever been targeted by a missile strike of this volume. The scale itself is historically unprecedented. But what made the Israeli Air Force HQ strike operationally decisive, rather than merely destructive on an enormous scale, was the same quality that distinguished the Tel Aviv port strike I analyzed for you previously: the architectural intelligence embedded in its design. The degree to which Iranian military planners had developed a precise, detailed, and operationally actionable understanding of the Kiryat compound's physical layout, the Israeli Air Force HQ's underground command architecture, its communications, routing, its power infrastructure, its ventilation systems, and the specific sequencing of munitions types required to defeat each layer of its protection, from the surface down to its deepest hardened facilities. I have been studying Iranian military planning capability for years on this channel, and what I am seeing in the operational architecture of the Israeli Air Force HQ strike represents a qualitative leap beyond anything Iran has previously demonstrated publicly. The targeting intelligence required to plan and execute a 2,100 missile strike against a hardened underground command complex in a dense urban environment, with the precision necessary to achieve the operational results visible tonight, is not the product of weeks of collection. It is the product of years of sustained multi-source intelligence development that has been building toward this operational moment across a time frame that Western intelligence assessments consistently underestimated. Iranian intelligence collection against the Kiryat compound and the Israeli Air Force HQ specifically drew on satellite imagery analysis conducted across multiple orbital platforms over years, signals intelligence intercepts that mapped the base communications architecture connecting the HQ to every element of the Israeli air power network. human intelligence sources with access to technical details of the compound's construction and underground layout, and systematic analysis of publicly available technical literature on deep underground command facility design and construction. The synthesis of these sources produced a targeting picture of extraordinary operational precision, one that mapped not just the surface layout of the Kyria compound, but the subsurface architecture of the Air Force HQ's command network, the locations of its primary and backup communications nodes, the routing of its power conduits and fiber connections, the positions of its ventilation shafts and emergency access infrastructure, and the specific depth and reinforcement characteristics of its most hardened command facilities. The 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 missiles were organized into 7 distinct strike echelons, each targeting specific elements of the Israeli Air Force HQ complex in a sequence designed to progressively defeat its layered protection from the perimeter defenses inward and from the surface installations downward to the deepest underground command spaces. The first echelon of 240 missiles launched at precisely 2:34 in the morning. I want you to fix that time in your mind, because everything that follows over the next 28 minutes proceeds from that moment with a precision of timing and targeting that I find operationally extraordinary to analyze. Those 240 missiles targeted the air defense installations, protecting the Kyria compound and the surrounding Tel Aviv urban zone specifically. The Patriot batteries, the David sling launchers, the short-range interceptor systems, and the radar infrastructure providing sensor coverage of the airspace above the compound were all struck simultaneously in the opening echelon. Within 2 minutes and 40 seconds of the first Khorramshahr-4 impacting, the air defense architecture protecting the Kyria compound had been effectively neutralized. Every subsequent echelon would operate against a target stripped of its organic defensive capability. The second echelon of 310 missiles arrived at 2:38 in the morning, targeting the surface installations of the Kyria compound itself. The above-ground administrative buildings, the surface communications infrastructure, the above-ground power distribution systems, the vehicle access points to the underground facility network, and the surface-level security emergency response infrastructure were all struck in this echelon. Iranian planners had clearly modeled the secondary effects of striking surface power infrastructure on the underground command facilities below and the simultaneous destruction of multiple redundant power input points to the underground network was a deliberate operational objective of the second echelon rather than an incidental effect of targeting surface structures. The third echelon of 350 missiles arrived at 2:41 in the morning and represented the first direct assault on the underground command complex itself. These missiles carried earth-penetrating warheads specifically configured for the defeat of the upper reinforcement layers protecting the Israeli Air Force HQ's underground facilities. The warheads used a tandem penetrating configuration, a hardened steel nose section, followed by a precursor-shaped charge that expanded the penetration channel before the main explosive payload detonated, maximizing both the depth achieved and the structural damage generated at each impact point. Against the reinforced concrete construction of the upper underground levels, these warheads performed precisely as their designers intended, cracking and collapsing sections of the upper protective layer and exposing the command facilities below to the direct strike echelons that followed. The fourth echelon of 320 missiles arrived at 2:44 in the morning, targeting the ventilation and access infrastructure of the underground command complex. What I find most operationally significant about this echelon is the precision of the targeting data required to execute it effectively. Iranian targeting intelligence had identified the locations of the Israeli Air Force HQ's primary and backup ventilation shafts, its emergency access tunnels, its fiber optic conduit routing, and its emergency power generator infrastructure with sufficient accuracy to direct missiles against each of these specific structural elements simultaneously. The destruction of ventilation infrastructure in a deeply hardened underground facility is not merely a life support attack. It is a structural attack that significantly reduces the facility's ability to withstand the overpressure effects of the heavy penetrating strikes that follow. Because a sealed and ventilation compromised underground space transmits blast energy through its structural elements far more efficiently than one with intact pressure relief pathways. The fifth echelon of 330 missiles arrived at 2:47 in the morning and represented the decisive deep penetration strike against the Israeli Air Force HQ's core command facilities. These missiles carried the heaviest and most technically sophisticated warheads in the entire strike package. Triple tandem penetrating warheads with multi-stage delayed action fusing calibrated to achieve maximum penetration depth before initiating the final detonation sequence. Against the now compromised upper protection layers, these warheads reached depths that classified Western assessments had previously described as beyond the capability of any existing Iranian conventional munition. The structural damage produced at these depths was catastrophic, collapsing internal command spaces, destroying the hardened electronic infrastructure housed within them, and severing the communications and power connections that linked the deepest command facilities to each other and to the broader Israeli military command network. The sixth echelon of 280 missiles arrived at 2:50 in the morning, targeting whatever structural integrity and operational capability remained in the upper and intermediate levels of the underground complex following the preceding five echelons. Iranian planners had modeled the progressive structural degradation produced by the first five echelons and designed the sixth to exploit the specific vulnerabilities that degradation had created, directing missiles against structural support elements that the preceding strikes had weakened to the point where additional targeted impacts would produce cascading collapse of the remaining intact spaces within the complex. The seventh and final echelon of 270 missiles arrived at 2:59 in the morning to complete the permanent destruction of the Israeli Air Force HQ complex and eliminate any possibility of recovery operations, restoring operational functionality within any relevant time frame. When the last Khorramshahr-4 impacted at 3:02 in the morning, 28 minutes after the first missile of the first echelon had struck the Kiryat compound's air defense installations, the command infrastructure that had directed Israeli air power for 4 decades had been reduced to collapsed tunnels, shattered concrete, and burning wreckage extending across the heart of Tel Aviv. The Israeli Air Force had not been destroyed as a collection of aircraft. It had been decapitated as a coherent fighting force. And without its command infrastructure, its communications architecture, and its centralized operational direction, every F-35I, every 15I, every air defense battery in Israel's inventory was an isolated platform rather than an integrated military capability. The Khorramshahr-4 is a weapon that I have been tracking on this channel since its public introduction and that I have consistently argued represents a more significant capability development than mainstream Western threat. Assessments have been willing to acknowledge. Tonight's events have validated that assessment in the most operationally decisive way possible, and I want to walk you through the specific technical characteristics that made 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 missiles capable of achieving what tonight demonstrated. The Khorramshahr-4, designated Khaybar by Iranian military authorities, in another deliberate historical reference, is a liquid-fueled medium-range ballistic missile with a demonstrated operational range of approximately 2,000 kilometers, placing all of Israeli territory well within its engagement envelope from launch positions across western and central Iran. I want to address the liquid fuel characteristic directly because it is often cited in Western assessments as a significant operational limitation that reduces the system's military utility compared to solid-fueled alternatives. That assessment underestimates the degree to which Iranian logistical infrastructure for liquid-fueled ballistic missile operations has matured over 4 decades of sustained development. Iranian missile forces operating Khorramshahr-4 systems have developed fueling procedures, launcher positioning protocols, and pre-launch preparation timelines that significantly compress the vulnerability window that liquid-fueled operations traditionally create. The guidance system of the Khorramshahr-4 represents the most significant technical advance relative to earlier Iranian liquid-fueled ballistic designs and is central to understanding the targeting precision demonstrated against the Israeli Air Force HQ tonight. Its navigation architecture combines inertial guidance with a terrain-referenced update system and in its terminal phase, an optical scene matching guidance system that compares real-time sensor imagery of the target area against preloaded reference imagery derived from satellite reconnaissance. This terminal optical guidance provides a targeting precision against fixed urban targets that is fundamentally independent of GPS availability and electronic jamming, and that is calibrated against the actual visual characteristics of the specific target structure rather than against geographic coordinates alone. The warhead variants deployed against the Israeli Air Force HQ complex represent an engineering achievement that I want to examine in detail because they are the technical foundation on which everything else tonight was built. The surface attack warheads used in the first two echelons were optimized blast and fragmentation designs executed to a standard of quality that reflects 4 decades of Iranian warhead manufacturing development. The earth-penetrating warheads used in the third echelon required hardened penetrator nose sections capable of surviving deceleration forces of tens of thousands of G during reinforced concrete penetration without structural failure. The engineering tolerances required to produce penetrator nose sections that maintain their structural integrity and fusing functionality through this deceleration environment are demanding, and the consistent performance of these warheads across hundreds of simultaneous impacts tonight demonstrated a manufacturing quality control standard that Western intelligence had not attributed to Iranian warhead production. The triple tandem deep penetration warheads used in the fifth echelon are the most technically remarkable element of the entire strike package. The first stage precursor charge creates an initial penetration channel. The second stage penetrator travels through that channel and uses its own shaped charge to extend it further and fracture the surrounding structure. The main penetrator then travels through the extended channel created by the first two stages before its delayed fuse initiates the primary explosive payload at a depth significantly greater than any single stage or dual stage penetrator could achieve against equivalent target protection. The depth performance achieved by these warheads against the Israeli Air Force HQ's deepest command facilities has generated what I can only describe as genuine shock within Western technical intelligence communities that had assessed the maximum penetration capability of Iranian conventional warheads as significantly less than what tonight demonstrated. The production of 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 missiles in operational deployment condition represents an industrial achievement that demands serious reassessment of Iranian missile manufacturing capacity assessments that the Western intelligence community has been maintaining as consensus positions despite accumulating evidence that they significantly underestimate actual Iranian production rates. The propulsion systems, the precision guidance components across multiple terminal guidance variants, the specialized warhead configurations across 7 distinct types, and the fueling and launch infrastructure required to coordinate 2,100 missiles into 7 sequenced echelons against a single complex urban target represent a manufacturing logistics and operational planning achievement that places Iranian strategic strike capability in a category that existing Western threat assessment frameworks were not designed to accommodate. Within 3 hours of the last Khorramshahr-4 impacting at the Israeli Air Force HQ, the President of the United States convened an emergency session of the National Security Council. I want to spend significant time on what that emergency session represents and what it signals, because I think it is being underanalyzed in the coverage I am seeing tonight, and because I believe it is ultimately more strategically consequential than the military strike that triggered it. Emergency NSC sessions are not convened casually. They are convened when the established frameworks for decision making have been disrupted by events that fall outside the parameters. Those frameworks were designed to manage when the options available to decision makers are all bad, and the consequences of choosing between them are severe and immediate. The convening of an emergency NSC session within 3 hours of the Israeli Air Force HQ strike is not a sign of a superpower managing a regional crisis from a position of strategic confidence. It is a sign of an establishment confronting a strategic reality that its planning assumptions told it could not exist and scrambling to develop a response framework for a situation that its existing playbooks do not adequately address. What I believe is happening inside that emergency session right now, based on everything I know about how American national security decision making functions under acute crisis conditions, is a confrontation between three institutional imperatives that cannot all be satisfied simultaneously and that are pulling the decision-making process in incompatible directions. The first imperative is the operational one, the imperative to protect American military assets from a demonstrated Iranian strike capability that has now shown itself capable of erasing a major Allied military command infrastructure in 28 minutes using over 2,000 missiles, coordinated into 7 precise echelons. Every American military commander with assets in the Eastern Mediterranean and Persian Gulf theater is tonight looking at the Israeli Air Force HQ strike and calculating what a Khorramshahr-4 strike package of equivalent scale directed against an American military installation or naval formation would produce. Those calculations are not producing reassuring answers, and the operational imperative generated by those calculations is pulling strongly toward repositioning American assets away from the threat environments where Iranian strike capability has demonstrated its most devastating performance. The second imperative is the alliance credibility one, the imperative to maintain the appearance of American commitment to Israeli security. That is the foundational premise of the American strategic position in the Middle East. A United States that responds to the erasure of Israeli Air Force command infrastructure with an emergency meeting rather than military action has visibly failed its most important regional ally at the moment of that ally's greatest military crisis. Every government in the Middle East is watching how Washington responds to this moment, and the conclusions they draw will shape regional alignment decisions that will define the strategic landscape for the next generation. The third imperative is the domestic political one. The American political environment does not tolerate the appearance of strategic failure. Well, and what happened at the Israeli Air Force HQ tonight is not a development that can be successfully characterized as anything other than a strategic failure of the deterrence posture that American military presence in the region was supposed to provide. Congressional leaders are going to demand explanations, accountability, and above all, action. The pressure for some form of visible American military response is going to be severe, regardless of whether the military assessment of the available response options is that any of them are strategically sound. The tension between these three imperatives, operational caution, alliance credibility, and domestic political pressure, is the engine driving the emergency NSC session that is happening right now in Washington. And the decisions that emerge from that session in the hours ahead will determine whether the United States attempts a military response that its operational commanders assess as carrying unacceptable risk, retreats further from its forward positions in a way that makes its alliance credibility crisis acute and permanent, or attempts some intermediate option that satisfies none of the three imperatives adequately and produces the worst elements of all three outcomes simultaneously. What I can tell you with confidence tonight is that none of the options available to the emergency NSC session are good. The Iranian operational demonstration at the Israeli Air Force HQ has not merely created a military problem for Washington. It has created a strategic trap in which every available response makes some dimension of America's strategic position worse, and in which the establishment's own planning assumptions have been so thoroughly invalidated that the frameworks it would normally use to navigate a crisis of this kind are no longer adequate to the reality it is navigating. The Allies watching Washington's emergency session from outside, from Riyadh and Ankara, from Seoul and Tokyo, from Warsaw and Berlin, are drawing conclusions from what they observe that will accelerate every strategic realignment that the preceding weeks of conflict had already set in motion. A Washington convening emergency sessions in response to Iranian military action rather than executing pre-planned deterrence responses is a Washington whose strategic playbook has been disrupted at a fundamental level. The Allies watching that disruption are updating their strategic calculations accordingly. The Khorramshahr-4 designated Khaybar carries a name that connects to the same historical consciousness I discussed when analyzing the Zulfiqar and Khaybar-Shekan strikes. But I want to go deeper into what that historical consciousness means operationally tonight because I think it explains something about the scale and ambition of the Israeli Air Force HQ strike that purely technical analysis misses. The choice to deploy 2,100 missiles against a single target in the heart of Tel Aviv is not just a military decision, it is a statement. It is a declaration about what Iranian strategic culture believes is now possible, about the distance that 4 decades of patient, nationally sustained military development have covered, and about the strategic confidence that accumulated operational success generates within a military establishment that has been told by external powers for decades that its ambitions exceeded its capabilities. Tonight, Iranian strategic planners demonstrated that their ambitions did not exceed their capabilities. They demonstrated that their capabilities exceeded every external assessment of them by a margin that has produced genuine shock across the Western strategic community. That shock is itself strategically significant. One of the most powerful tools available to a military establishment is the ability to generate in its adversaries the psychological experience of having their assumptions violated at a fundamental level. When an adversary's planning assumptions are violated, when the thing that was supposed to be impossible demonstrably happens, the psychological effect on institutional decision making is severe and lasting. Decision makers who have had their assumptions violated at this level do not simply update those assumptions and proceed with confidence. They begin to doubt the reliability of every assessment they have made, every assumption they are still relying on, every projection about what their adversary can and cannot do. That doubt is corrosive to strategic confidence and to the decisive action that strategic confidence enables. The American establishment sitting in its emergency NSC session tonight is experiencing exactly this psychological dynamic. Every planning assumption about Iranian capability that informed American deterrence posture in the Middle East has been violated by the operational demonstrations of this conflict. And an establishment operating without reliable planning assumptions is an establishment that is functionally incapable of the decisive strategic action that its global role demands of it. The erasure of Israeli Air Force command infrastructure and Washington's emergency session have produced second-order effects across the global strategic landscape that I want to walk through carefully because I believe they represent the dimensions of tonight's events that will matter most over the longest time frame. The immediate military consequence is the effective neutralization of Israeli air power as a coherent strategic instrument. Individual Israeli aircraft remain physically intact. Individual air defense batteries remain operational. But without the centralized command infrastructure that translates individual platform capability into coordinated military power, Israel's Air Force is a collection of assets rather than a fighting force. The air superiority that has been the foundational premise of Israeli military strategy since 1967 has been suspended. How long it takes to restore some form of distributed command capability and what the regional military balance looks like during that restoration period are questions that every actor in the Middle East is urgently calculating. Tonight, the energy market consequences are severe and accelerating. Oil prices, responding to the Israeli Air Force HQ strike, are moving in ways that financial markets were not positioned for, because the consensus planning scenario did not include the possibility of Israeli air power command infrastructure being erased in 28 minutes by an Iranian ballistic missile strike. The supply disruption premium built into energy prices is expanding as market participants reassess the conflict's duration and escalation potential in light of an Iranian operational demonstration that exceeded every prior capability assessment by a substantial margin. Russia and China are tonight in a position of extraordinary strategic advantage that neither could have achieved through any direct action of their own. Moscow is collecting energy revenue windfalls driven by supply disruption, while watching American strategic credibility suffer its most damaging series of blows since the fall of Saigon. Beijing is watching the dollar system enter structural stress, while the alternative financial and trade infrastructure it has been building for over a decade gains adoption momentum from governments that have concluded the American-led order can no longer be relied upon as the stable foundation of global commerce. The four-power axis of Iran, Russia, China, and their aligned partners has not merely challenged the American-led order tonight, it has operationally dismantled its most visible instrument of enforcement in the Middle East theater, and demonstrated to every watching government that the dismantling is real, irreversible, within any near-term time frame, and the dismantling product of deliberate, coordinated, strategic action rather than accident or opportunism. The governments watching from outside the immediate conflict zone are absorbing the lessons of tonight with a clarity and a speed that Washington would find alarming if it were paying sufficient attention to the signals being generated in the state capitals across the global south. The American security guarantee, the promise that American air power will be present, that American military capability stands behind every formal alliance commitment, has been tested by operational reality in the Eastern Mediterranean and found to have limits that no official communication had ever acknowledged. Those limits are now known. They will be factored into every strategic calculation made by every government that has previously structured its security arrangements around assumptions of American reliability. The strategic realignments that follow will reshape the global order in ways that the emergency NSC session happening in Washington right now is not adequately equipped to manage. I want to close tonight's analysis by stepping back from the operational detail and speaking directly about what this moment means, because I think it deserves more than a strategic summary, and I think my audience deserves more than clean conclusions wrapped in analytical language. The Israeli Air Force headquarters that was erased at 2:34 this morning was not simply a military facility. It was the physical expression of a strategic philosophy that has governed Israeli military thinking and American Middle East strategy for 4 decades. That philosophy held that air power supremacy, backed by American commitment and sustained by the qualitative technological advantages that Western defense industries could produce, represented a guarantee of Israeli strategic security that no adversary Iran could plausibly field was capable of fundamentally disrupting. It held that the combination of Israeli technological excellence, American strategic weight, and the deep underground hardening of critical command infrastructure had created military assets that existed beyond the reach of conventional Iranian attack. 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 missiles arriving in 7 sequenced echelons over 28 minutes have delivered the definitive operational verdict on that philosophy. The verdict is not ambiguous. It is not a data point that can be absorbed into existing analytical frameworks with minor adjustments. It is a verdict that requires those frameworks to be rebuilt from honest foundations rather than inherited assumptions. The emergency NSC session convening in Washington tonight is not the response of a superpower managing a regional crisis from a position of strategic confidence. It is the response of an establishment confronting the simultaneous collapse of multiple planning assumptions that its institutional culture had treated as permanent features of the strategic landscape. An establishment in that position does not make good strategic decisions quickly. It makes reactive decisions under maximum institutional stress with minimum deliberative capacity in a political environment that punishes honest assessment and rewards the projection of confidence, regardless of whether that confidence reflects operational reality. What comes out of Washington's emergency session in the hours ahead will determine whether the United States responds to this forced strategic reckoning with the honest institutional adaptation that the situation demands, or whether it retreats into the reactive escalation of a wounded institution that mistakes aggression for strategy and motion for direction. That choice is live right now. Its consequences will echo across the global strategic landscape for decades. For the governments watching from outside the immediate conflict zone, the lesson of 234 this morning is being absorbed with a clarity and a permanence that Washington would find alarming if its emergency session were paying sufficient attention to the signals being generated in every capital that has previously structured its security calculations around American reliability. The American security guarantee has been tested at the highest operational level and found to have limits. Those limits are now a permanent feature of the strategic landscape. They will shape the decisions of every government navigating that landscape for the next generation. I want to leave you with the question that I believe is the most important strategic question being asked in any capital anywhere in the world at this moment. In a world where Iranian operational capability has demonstrated the power to erase a major Allied military command infrastructure in 28 minutes using over 2,000 ballistic missiles and to produce an emergency session rather than a military response from the world's most powerful nation. What does American extended deterrence actually guarantee? What is it worth in the operational environments that matter? And what should every government that has built its strategic foundation on that guarantee be doing right now to prepare for a world in which the guarantee's limits have been made permanently and operationally visible? I do not have a clean answer tonight. What I have is the commitment to keep asking that question honestly, to keep following the evidence wherever it leads, and to keep delivering the analysis to this community without softening conclusions when they point somewhere difficult. That is what U.S. Watch Truth exists to do. If tonight's analysis gave you the depth and the honesty that you came here for, I need you to make this video reach the people who need to see it. Share it across every platform you use. Send it to everyone in your life who is trying to make genuine sense of what is happening in the world right now. Hit like if this gave you something the mainstream coverage of tonight's events did not. Subscribe to this channel if you want to be here for every development that follows. Bring your own assessment into the comments. Tell me where you think I have this right and where you think I have it wrong. Tell me what questions tonight's events are raising for you that I have not addressed. The conversation this community generates is as important to me as the content itself, and I engage with everything you bring to it. I will be here for every chapter of what comes next. U.S. Watch Truth does not look away when the analysis gets difficult. We did not look away tonight. We will not start tomorrow. Stay locked in.